Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and for some it's actually morning. Good morning. I'm happy to welcome you to today's seminar organized by the Condensed Matter Physics Group of the ICTP East African Institute for Fundamental Research. Today, the seminar is at an unusual time because our guest has other commitments, but we're very happy to have him for this period. So our guest is Professor Evgeny PIDKO, and who is an expert in catalysis. He'll be telling us about different things in catalysis. Before he begins, I'll tell you a little bit about him. He received his PhD from Eindhoven University of Technology and became an assistant professor of catalysis for sustainability there. And then in 2016, he obtained an ERC grant to learn, understand, and control the deactivation phenomena in hydrogenation catalysis. Then he went to Delft University as an associate professor, and then later he became a full professor in 2020. He's a member of the advisory boards of ChemCatChem, Catal Science Technology Journals. He's an editorial board member of Catal and Main Communication Journals. He's an author of more than 200 publications, particularly in computational, physical, inorganic, chemistry, and chemical engineering. Actually, one thing I didn't know about him before was that he combines experiment and theory. Okay, so today he'll be talking to us about catalysis, particularly how great accuracy in catalysis is helping. Great accuracies in computational catalysis is helping to better understand catalysis. So over to you, Prof. Evgeny. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. I'm very happy to see so many attendants. Yes, I will be talking today about computational chemistry, and the talk that I prepared is centered around the question that I was asking myself throughout my career. When I started with my PhD with Rutger van Zanten, I learned from him the idea that we are we are approaching now the era of rational catalyst design. Everybody in the beginning of the 2000s were telling that we are like one step away from being able to predict a better catalyst. The only thing that is missing is the accuracy, maybe, and maybe power. 20 years later, we have the power, we have the accuracy, but we are not still able to predict. So the question that I was asking myself, what's wrong? When can we expect the rise of the machines that will be able to predict the catalyst? And I think that there are several aspects of the accuracy problem that are hampering the ability of our models to predict the new catalysts or predict how to carry out the catalytic reactions. So before I go, just in case there is time limited, I would like to thank a few organizations that funded this research. So most of the research I will be talking about was funded by European Research Council. A bit was funded by Advanced Research Center Chemical Building Block, and NVO is Dutch fund for fundamental research, is providing us access to the supercomputer. There's a picture from last September of my group, and you can see that it's a very diverse group of people. We have in our team a power lifter, a champion, Dutch champion in powerlifting, this gentleman, for example. We have experimentalists, theorists, we have everything, very diverse group. And we're working together to figure out how to combine the theory and experiment to be able to design new process for the catalytic upgrading of plastic, waste, CO2, biomass, to chemicals that we want to have. So we are basically trying to understand how we can solve the multi-scale, this multidisciplinary problem of catalysis, connect chemical and engineering to build a platform for processing catalyst design. We also understand that when we design a catalyst for a process, we also have to put some characteristics of the material in it. So it becomes a very multidisciplinary, multidimensional program where we realize the importance of the modern information and computational technologies, of course. The topics which I'm working on are quite conservative. Here, I just present you an overview of the citation or what kind of chemistries we are working on in my group. We are working quite a lot in the last years in organometallic chemistry because I understood that when you try to immediately solve the complexity problem of real industrial heterogeneous catalyst, you enter the complexity of the chemical space that is very difficult to comprehend, and we put a lot of efforts into developing new models for organometallic chemistry to at least know what we put in the reactor. This chemistry has also a lot of industrial applications. I will not talk about them, but we do that. A big part of our work is catalysis and computational chemistry and chemistry of catalyst deactivation. And in this lecture today, I will be talking about zeolites and hydrogenation chemistry when explaining our field. The main topics that we are working can be classified in these 4 domains. This is chemistry automation. Since like 5 years, we are putting a lot of efforts into making new workflows for experimental and computational chemistry to produce data that could be used to create predictive models, kinetic models, for example, or to tune and benchmark our computational predictions. For the computational chemistry, we are working on automating reaction network discovery or screening of the catalyst in silico. And this is all connected to applied homogeneous catalysis efforts where we are developing new catalysts and organometallic systems for CO2 conversion, mostly hydrogenation catalysis. And my old love is catalysis and confinement, where we also try to do a lot of automation and computations where we work with zeolite catalysis. And all of that is supported by the new ideas on operando modeling. What I mean by that is not really multi-scale modeling, when you are calculating different scales and then integrate them by using constants that are independent for each of the scale that you're working on. But when you are trying to understand how the gradients at the molecular or the mesoscale can affect the fundamental reactivity parameters, such as thermodynamics and kinetics. And I will touch upon that quickly, but most of the talk today will be focused on this and this part, just as the most applied. So our main goal is to integrate theory and experiment in a way to become more predictive, to be able to predict or rationalize the experiment better, to solve the molecular problem of catalysis. And since before I started my PhD, I have already tried to do the integration of theory and experiment. And this is the paper from before my PhD time when I was working in Moscow with Professor Kazansky. We were doing an experimental work on studying how alkanes absorb on copper ions in ZSM5 zeolite. And we calculated very simplistic models, we measured spectra, and we were able to correlate the theoretical predictions with the experiments. And this very simplistic model and this very good agreement was already back then an indication for us that theory can help predicting. And after studying with Kazansky, I joined the group of Van Santen, who was postulating this prism, where his idea for rational catalysis design was that if we integrate synthesis in situ spectroscopy mechanism on the foundation of theoretical chemistry, we will be able to achieve the molecular control of the catalysis. So that is 20 years ago, the postulation, but we still are very often using theory for prediction. So if you look at the historical developments in catalysis and in the computational chemistry, you will quite quickly realize that most of the developments in the empirical and the theory questions were passing through the stage of first empirical knowledge, some model development, but then studies in catalysis on molecular scale. We came to the point that we understand systems on the molecular scale, and now we are entering the understanding of a cross scale, and we encounter the problem that we can understand the cross scale of some of the systems, but then the number of parameters become explosive. And we hope now that with the help of big data, we will come to the rational design. But this picture is the illustration that 20 years ago, we thought that we are standing still here. and that with more power in the computational models, we will be able to come to rational design. But we are still there. We just introduced another sort of a tool that we hope that will help us. So that's sort of an introduction of my views on the things, and I don't have the answers where we will come ever to the rational design. I hope that we will. But we already see that DFT is an important part of catalysis research. Computational chemistry has become the tool that almost everybody is using. And in this group, I shouldn't spend much time on explaining how theory is important for our work, but I can tell you that this is the picture that I created. I didn't specify with other things. It's just a literature analysis where I tried to look how the number of publications where catalysis and theory are used together was increasing in the last years. And you can clearly see that we have a drastic increase of the number of DFT calculations in catalytic studies. But when you read the papers, you will realize that, especially from the experimental point of view, especially all these high-profile publications that we can see in the Nature Catalysis Journal, for example, recently, theory is very often used as the way to explain the experimental observations. So if I try to make a metaphor here, this is how the modern most of the catalytic studies are designed. So you have quite a big chunk of catalytic tests with a lot of data, very complex information. You cannot digest it really. Then you have a beautiful layer of spectroscopy, very tasteful gem of operando spectroscopy, more catalytic tests, more spectroscopy. And as a cherry on the pie, there is a theory. And of course, the tests, the empirical practice of catalysis is at the forefront of all of this research. And all of the additional information still remains sort of the decoration of the research. The dream that I at least have is that the catalytic test, the most demanding and just proof of concept, will become a frame of this huge piles of taste provided by theory and modeling and the operando spectroscopy. But what are the problems that do not allow us to come to this brilliant and tasty version of the catalytic dessert? And I think that the main problem there is that we are working with too many unknowns. We're trying to answer too many questions simultaneously, and we try to focus on very tangible deliverable, like we want to improve the process, but we are not sure that we know the active site, we don't know the mechanism, we make too many assumptions. When the question is asked about how theory and IT can facilitate the catalyst and process discovery, most of the computational chemists and experimentalists will say that, you know, we tried theory, but your methods are not good enough. We don't get the agreement between theory and experiment. And if you read most of the literature on the theory, you will see this type of picture and a lot of discussion around it. A lot of discussion will be around the method accuracy, or as I say it, I'm not a native English speaker, I may use it wrong, but for me it's precision of your methodology. How precisely how close it becomes to the reality description, to the real electronic structure, right? So it's a mathematical problem. And of course, we have a lot of literature, a lot of reviews and books explaining how we can achieve the chemical accuracy. And most of the time, you can always blame your method because we are not able to use the chemical accuracy limit for a realistic system. You have to go to the lower level. You can always blame the disagreement between theory and experiment on the low level of your theory. However, there is another dimension. To be honest, there is several dimensions of accuracy when you are talking about realistic chemical systems. There's a very big difference between the solid state physics, for example, and the chemical systems. In solid state physics, as far as I understand, at least in material sciences, you are working with equilibrium structures, or at least relatively static structures. And that simplifies a lot the problem. In chemistry, we are working with dynamics and reactive systems. So we have, on top of the complex physical phenomena that can affect the reactivity, we can have a lot of chemical features that are very difficult to model because they will require making model very complicated. But they are representing a part of the model accuracy. So basically, there is always this compromise between the model and method accuracy that you have to achieve. And because of this multidimensional set of the parameters that affect your accuracy, by missing some of these parameters, by operating at the lower scale of any of these parts, you create a chance that you get an agreement between theory and experiment, but not because of the actual agreement, but because of the cancellation of errors or something. So it's important to critically look at what agrees with the experiment, where the method, how good we are in terms of the methods for describing chemistry or chemical problems, and how good we are in describing models in chemistry when we talk about the catalyst. So these are the two topics that I'm going to discuss with you today, with a few examples from our own research and reference to some other papers. So if you talk about the method accuracy, the easiest thing, and that's what I started in my career from, is to carry out computational spectroscopy. And in the last years, it has become quite standard in the chemistry and in the physics community to assume and to basically believe that we are already able to use DFT methodologies to rationalize quite complicated computational spectra. There was a very nice Nature Review paper on the computational spectroscopy methods. And you can see here some examples of experimental and theoretical spectra of molecular systems that are in a perfect agreement right away. They all deal with explaining the system in the ground state and explaining the excitations. But it's the geometry where you start from is usually you start from the ground state, optimize structure, and then explain the spectroscopic properties of this static system. If we talk about computational spectroscopy and homogeneous catalysis, this is what I'm going to talk now about. And in this lecture, I will show you with examples of homogeneous catalysis when we are certain about what we work on, because we can isolate the products, we can isolate the species that we characterize, and I will show you how spectroscopy works there. So here we work in the last years a lot on the homogeneous hydrogenation catalysis using manganese. The idea is very simple. You are reducing a substrate to a product, and this is a very big class of organic chemistry reactions, ranging from CO2 hydrogenation to formates to hydrogenation of some chiral, to making chiral alcohol products or amines. So it's a very wide range of reactions. The field is dominated by noble metals, rhodium, palladium, and there is a high desire to replace them with elements such as manganese or iron. Here we include cobalt, but cobalt better also to be excluded. Manganese and iron are fantastic metals, and there is a big question. Can we replace palladium or rhodium, which are very expensive, difficult to mine, with something much more earth abundant and available all over the world? So we, in our research, were working with a few catalysts, and other groups were working, and here are some examples of homogeneous catalysts that are active in the conversion of carbonyl-containing compounds to alcohols. And an important feature in these systems is that you have a manganese center, the metal center that is responsible for the hydrogenation function, and you have next to it an acidic proton. In the system of Sartay, you don't have this proton, but people say this mechanistic study shows that there is a possibility of chemoability and the formation of the acidic protons. Sigma complexes with manganese are also substantially acidic. So we, most of these catalysts are operating at the catalyst concentrations more than 0.1 mole%. And for some reason, it was very big challenge to decrease the concentration of the catalyst that would deactivate. In our studies, we came up with this complex that combines N-heterocyclic carbene arm with a phosphine arm connected through an amino group, this type of tridentate pincer complex that is extremely active for this reaction under low concentration of a catalyst and high temperature. And even though in organic chemistry, these conditions are considered to be harsh, from the process engineering perspective, these are a nice opportunity for making the reaction faster. So what this graph shows that we can have a very, very quick reaction without any sign of deactivation at the catalyst concentration of 5 ppm. And this is the concentration of metal contaminants in most of the substrates that we use. So it's actually the real catalyst that you add negligible amount of the catalyst and reaction goes. So we worked on this system, and of course we did a lot of spectroscopy studies to understand how the system works, and we identified that our catalyst is originally present in non-pincer, but a sort of facial tridentate coordination. It needs to be activated with a base to remove the proton and then an ionic species, and then this complex reacts with hydrogen slowly to form this pincer hydrido complex that is one of the reactive species. We observe spectroscopically different, we can observe spectroscopically signatures, and we can deduce what kind of species it is. But we also can do calculations, and because this is so simple models, molecular result, we can use hybrid DFT methodologies, quite standard approaches. And our spectra, you can see almost one-to-one in agreement between the theory and experiment. Of course, we don't choose these molecules based on the agreement with the experiment, but these are the most stable species that are predicted from this type of transformations. And they immediately give you almost a one-to-one agreement within 20 reciprocal centimeters, which is a perfect spectroscopic agreement that we can achieve. There's another example when there is a question.
Yeah, so this is TDDFT or
no. This is infrared spectroscopy. This is just infrared vibrational spectroscopy.
Vibrational. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have said that. So similarly, the previous example was isolated complexes or in situ formed. But if you carry out the reaction in situ and monitor how it goes, you can sometimes detect species that would be less resolved. And here is the example of an in situ spectrum of combination of two complexes. And that's how their spectroscopic signatures are predicted from DFT. Again, one-to-one agreement, which was a surprise to us, but it's a continuous surprise. Similarly, we can now able to calculate NMR parameters just using the standard approaches implemented in most of the computational software, and we get again an excellent agreement between the NMR and the NMR chemical shift of the hydride, for example, and the calculated chemical shift. So spectroscopy, the properties of the minima equilibrium structures, of the minima structures, or metastable structures, at least, some minimal the potential on the surface, is already there. So we have tools that if we are molecularly resolved, if we have the right molecular structure, we can, using quite standard for modern computational chemistry approaches, predict their vibrational spectra or NMR spectroscopy tools. We don't go into UV spectroscopy, but I have examples where UVs with time-dependent DFT can be predicted for relatively simple systems pretty well. But we are working with reactivity. So we basically need to know something about the changes in the free energy, either activation free energy or the free energy of the reaction. So what I showed you before, that we can predict the properties of the minimum. And now the questions are about how we can predict the the properties of the changes when you go along the reaction coordinate. And again, the very simple example for that could be predicting a pKa, right? This is reactivity. And this is an example of the work that we have carried out together with my colleague, Dr. Sinha, when we tried to predict the pKa using XTB calculations. XTB is a semi-empirical electronic structure method that is much faster than density functional theory. So if we would have done it with DFT, the line would be much better, but we would waste a lot of time to do that. So you can see here that if you try to predict for a wide range of systems the reactivity, the methods for fast calculations are not good enough. What can we do to improve them? Again, we have the methods to improve that. So what we have done in our work, we combined we collected a database of transition metal complexes containing experimental pKs. We got the XYZ coordinates for all of them. We calculate with DFTB this bad geometry optimization Hessian structures that takes minutes. These structures were re-optimized using density functional theory at the level that is similar to what I showed you in the previous line. And we were able to, and that would take hours. So we could get with DFT to the level of prediction comparable to the experiment that would be substantial deviations. What alternative exists is to improve the DFTB by using molecular machine learning approaches. So what we were doing, we were using a very simple learn approach, just linear correlations, where we combined the experimental pK values with the XTB, and we were able to improve, and this is the validation set, if I'm not mistaken, improve the predictive power of our method. First of all, it would now operate within seconds and not minutes, so it's very fast. And it would give a prediction that is much better than what we had before in the XTB itself. So what this says, again, if you know if your geometry is good enough, and XTB gives you good enough geometries, you can use modern tools to improve the accuracy even for these complicated reactivity systems, right? But again, these pKas are not representative to real catalytic systems, and real catalysis is of course defined by not only one reaction or one parameter, one thermodynamic parameter, but is rather a more complex function of a wide range of reaction channels that can take place or be open within your catalytic system, which are all the function of many different parameters of your conditions. And when you do DFT calculations on the reactions in the liquid phase, you have to take care of the conditions. What we normally do in the DFT calculations, you can do, so normally you can easily do DFT calculations in the molecules in vacuum, right? So this is the model systems where you just take gas phase species and calculate these delta G values for them. For molecular chemists, we have implicit solvent models where we are adding the, basically we are considering every species in our interacting system in a separate flask. So we are calculating solvation energy for the solvent only, and we don't consider them interacting. But reality is much more complicated, and in real situation, this is an illustration of how you can envisage an autoclave with a catalytic reaction mixture. We have a solvent, you have gas, with different components, and all of these components are interacting with each other, and none of them can be described in terms of the ideal gas approximation or ideal solution. And the question comes, you can ask yourself, so now we increase the complexity of the model system. Will our method still be able to account for this? Are we still able to explain or get the accuracy that we need for prediction or for proper agreement between theory and experiment? And here I would like to get back to our hydrogenation chemistry. And I didn't have much time. I don't have much time to explain you many details of these reactions. But most importantly is that we studied the particular reactions where the alcohol is reacting with the complex to form an alkoxide atom. And we measured this reaction using UV-vis spectroscopy. We monitored this reaction at different concentration of a base that is not present in this reaction. And the base is needed for the catalytic reaction itself, but not for this step. And what we noticed, that addition of a component of a reaction mixture that is not participating formally in the chemical transformation that we monitor can accelerate the reaction, number one, so it's a catalyst, but also it can change the thermodynamics of the reaction. So basically, we were adding an alkoxide base to the reaction system, and what we saw was that if without a base, this reaction is fully exergonic, so it goes with -4 kilojoules per mole, it's a very low number. But if you increase the amount of base, the reaction becomes endergonic, so it becomes unfavorable. And this very small change, but very important for the reaction, we were able to reproduce, at least qualitative, based on the COSMA-RES calculations. So what I wanted to say here is that even this very minor details, if you know what kind of chemistry is happening, our modern methodologies, which are generally available to everybody all over the world using open source computational packages and different approaches, they are allowing us to get quantitative or semi-quantitative agreement between the experiment and theory of very complex chemical systems. What is very important here is that we know for certain what kind of structures we are working on. So the model accuracy that we are discussing here is only limited to how we are describing the chemical system, but not what kind of chemical object we are dealing with. And this is very different from the situation that we encounter in heterogeneous catalysis. In heterogeneous catalysis, you very often do not know what exactly the active site is, what exactly the chemical composition, the stoichiometry, and even geometry of your active sites are. For example, if you talk about the zeolites, you usually start from a reasonably well-defined, a proton form of zeolite. We forget now that the zeolite in experiment is not necessarily a defect-free material. I can name you, we can have a separate discussion of that, how important the role of extra framework aluminum on your zeolites are, how the silanol defects can control the type of the species that you're forming. Let's forget about it. But even when you have only the protons and aluminum, upon the reaction in solution with the metal source, you can start making inside a wide range of species. And my own experience says that you are very seldom able to control 100% what kind of species you form. But even if you control, you never know what exactly you are generating there. So let me illustrate it a bit better by going into a specific example of zeolite catalysis for methane, partial oxidation of methane to methanol. So this is a picture illustrating for you that it's an important reaction because methane is an important global gas with a global warming potential, and it is generating all over the place. So it's a gas that is generating on the from the wastes, from the bio wastes, and so on and so forth. And if we have a way how to at low temperature convert methane to liquids, to methanol, it can create an opportunity for valorizing methane and using it for the chemical production. So it has been found that if you exchange copper into zeolites, you are able to establish a process that not really catalytic, but a sort of sequential process where you activate your material, expose it to methane, and your methane is consumed by the zeolite, after which you have to extract the product and you're forming methanol. So again, technologically, there are challenges, but what is very important that these copper-containing zeolites are able to activate methane to methanol, confined inside the zeolite, in terms of methoxy species or some other species, at relatively low temperature. Many people were studying it. The first study that reported this work has been published by Belgian group, by Bert Sells, in 2005, and it has been proposed that it's this type of copper O2 copper species that is the active species. In 2009, they refined their idea and they came back to the model that has been proposed by Zekina long before for copper-containing zeolites, but this time for this reaction, copper has been proposed. In 2015, we, together with the group of Johannes Lercher, proposed, based on the combination of DFT and EXAPS, a copper trimer. Then copper monomer was proposed. Palagin and Jeroen van Boekhoven were considering larger structures. So you see, people are discussing the same material. Material didn't change. The way it activates methane didn't change. Even spectroscopy didn't change. So everybody has the same spectroscopic signatures, but everybody is proposing different actives. And this brings me to a question. Are we good there with our methods? So let's try to look at how well our modern computational methods can help us to assist the characterization of spectroscopic features that we have in heterogeneous catalysis. And here I would like to go back to NMR. I showed you that for proton NMR and homogeneous catalysis, DFT is fantastic. Everything is perfectly predicted. And we tried together with the group of Stepanov from Novosibirsk, and that was work of Kolganov, Alexander, who is now a postdoc in my group in Delft. We tried to look, so we have the experimental data for methane activation by copper ZSM5, and we observed 3 peaks. Different groups were assigning different bands to different species. For example, the peak at 63 ppm, the signal 63 ppm, has been assigned by Kolganov to this type of species, to methanol bound in between of 2 copper sites. Shushkevich and Jeroen-Buckhoven proposed it is just a copper 1 site interacting with 1 methanol molecule. Nessimhan and co-authors said that it's a methoxy group bound by 2 copper sites. Similarly, the feature at 59 has been again proposed by some author to be a copper-bound methoxy group or silicon-bound methoxy group on the zeolite lattice. There is almost no doubt that 53 signal, 53 ppm, is just methanol adsorbed to the acidic protons. So let's start with something we know for sure. We know from many studies in the field how to make methoxy group on the zeolite lattice and how to isolate and characterize it. There are many studies, so we can benchmark our models. And what we have done, we have calculated for using a big cluster model of a ZSM5 zeolite. We considered many different T sites, different combinations of T sites within the cluster, and we calculated using this combination of DFT and basis sets, using fully optimized structure or just single point on the cluster from periodically optimized structure. We did the prediction of the NMR shift. Most important, if your geometry is right, if you optimize everything well, and if all geometry is perfectly optimized, you get a perfect agreement between the theory and experiment. So the computed NMR parameters for the species that we know how it looks like fit exactly the value that we get for the from the experiment. What is important here to realize that in solid state NMR, the peaks are quite broad, and the accuracy limit of most of our computational methods is such that it falls within the width of this band. We clearly see that if you're using non-hybrid DFT, you're well off the prediction, but all hybrid DFT methods are giving you very similar prediction of the position of signature, NMR signature of this for this species. So what it says that even for heterogeneous catalysis, if we know the structure, everything is perfect. We know the structure, we can predict its properties. Now, what are the products that you can generate with methane by copper ZSM5? The problem here is that we don't know the structure of the copper site. We can expect different things and we can calculate all of them. So we can expect that it's just copper 1 adsorbing methanol, copper 1 adsorbing dimethyl ether, or it can be a copper dimer having a hydroxyl group and methoxy sitting on the oxygen of the zeolite. So many different structures. So we calculated for all of that. And what we found, very interesting. So first of all, again, everything for protic zeolites is working. The proposal of Narishman that a methanol on an acidic proton of zeolite should give you a feature at 53 ppm is in line with the theory with our theories. But everything, all the model for the copper, for some reason, are not matching this peak at 63. So very interestingly, that we have almost an exact agreement between the theoretically predicted NMR parameters of methanol on acidic protons or for the species for which we know the geometry. When we enter the world of unknown, when we try to explore or assign the feature to things where we don't have exact information about the chemical structure, such as the methanol interacting with the copper sites, we get species all over the place. One parameter that is close to what we what we computed is a methoxy group on a zeolite with a reduced copper site in the neighborhood. Again, the difference with the other ones is quite substantial, so it can be everything. It can be also copper plus and methanol. And here the question comes about the model accuracy and the chemistry. When we are introducing copper in the zeolite, we are increasing the number of variables, so there can be different type of copper species formed. And then you are measuring the spectrum, and you're obtaining a reflection, sort of a one data point or reflection of reality. And this is a nice picture that I managed to publish at some point, is an illustration of the model in physics, a spherical cow moving with the speed of light. And the illustration is that our model is always not perfect. The question is that how do we select the models? If we select our models by a selected agreement between the theory, between the model and the experiment, in this case, I select the agreement by spectroscopy of this picture is in a very close agreement to spectroscopy of this picture. I did it on Photoshop, so I can guarantee that in the original Photoshop there was an agreement. But if you do not include the key details of the system, for example, the number of the cows there, you will not be able to describe the function, you will not be able to get the agreement. So when we talk about the structural problem of zeolites, we try to make the simplest model possible for our calculations. And especially for cations in the zeolites, there are many stoichiometry possible, but each stoichiometry allows you for different combinations. So the classical approach to solving the structural problem is to get inspired by molecular biochemical problems, get proposal based on apparent stoichiometry, and provide a proposal on the structure. So in the case of copper sites, my colleagues and myself were working with an idea that in biology, there were proposals on the trinuclear copper clusters, and Sonny Chen was putting forward this idea that, sorry for that, that copper trimers can be important entities for oxygen activation. My colleagues at TU Munich and Pacific Northwest were working with the copper morganites, and they were exchanging copper morganites with copper. You can introduce copper plus sites and then oxidize them. Well, they were observing a very interesting thing. They were observing that these systems are consuming one methanol molecule per 3 copper sites at low pressure. But if you increase pressure, you get to 2 methanol molecules per 3 copper sites. Depending on what you believe in, one can say that it's 1 to 2, so it's 2 copper sites, but it is surprisingly nice correlation suggesting that number 3 is important for copper sites in the zeolites. At least that's what we believe in, or at least that's what we think is important to consider. Back in 2015, we built this ab initio thermodynamic analysis model. What it does, you calculate with DFT the stability of different configurations, and you relate them, because they have varied amount of oxygens and coppers, to the chemical potential of oxygen and water. And that can connect you to stability of different species in the under the conditions of the chemical reaction. What we found here, most important here, is that what you didn't consider in your analysis will not be in your analysis, right? What we found in this discussion, that if you calcine your material under vacuum, you probably will form this copper or copper species. But if you have a high oxygen pressure, you will start forming more oxygenated copper cluster. That was the main conclusion. And wait a second. Yes. And here I would like to just slow down a bit, even though I should speed up probably in view of time, about the accuracy, because many of you are computational physicists and computational chemists, and you can always say again, like, you make the system complicated and you try to agree with experiment. That's why, you know, with bad method, you can find agreement with everything. So we tried to verify our methodology. We tried this copper trimer, and we looked how well our DFT method predicts compared to wave function based method. So we did COS-PT2. I think it was 16. It was a huge one. And basically, to make a long story short, the electronic structure that PBE predicts with a substantial oxygen radical anion character on the oxygens is predicted also by the CAS-PD2 calculations, suggesting that even for this potentially multi-reference system, PBED3 gives a very good answer. So knowing that our methods are good for electronic structure for the same geometry, if you know chemical structure, it will give us the right answer. We went further and we found that for this copper trimer, very interestingly, indeed, activation of one methanol molecule is favorable, and you need to go to high pressure to get two molecules activated. This is the delta G, computed delta G for the reaction of one methanol, two methanol, three methanol molecules as a function of chemical potential of methane. So it shows you why, it explains why you need to increase the pressure of methane to be able to activate more methane. It's a purely thermodynamic problem. But now, it seems like everything agrees again. But then we worked on this topic for a while, and I started getting comments or getting discussions with my students. They started wondering if our initial proposal, copper trimer, of this system is the correct one. They started asking me, how do I know that this is the right answer? How do I know that this was the right geometry? And I answered him and her that we did optimization, so we got it, and we didn't see any other species. But my students were quite smart, and they said, like, wait, but what if we were here? How do you know that we didn't end up here? So my answer was, of course, that we have agreement with experiment. But my students don't trust me, and they decided to develop the method or to employ the method to optimize, to carry out global optimization. We tried genetic algorithm to also explore different stoichiometries, but we found that we could not do it at DFT level. We tried XTB, and we found that XTB-based optimizations of copper clusters give us wrong results. So we had to exploit a different approach, and we came up with a method that is based on molecular dynamic exploration of configurational space of our copper cluster. So what we do RMSD biased molecular dynamics. So we force them. We do low mode molecular dynamics. We add an additional potential to our molecular dynamics simulation that follows the low modes, the isomerization modes, vibrational modes of our structure. And we sort of force our system to explore different configurational regimes. We are creating these big trajectories from which, by using K-Medoids clustering approach, we are identifying structures which are different from each other. Then we refine them with ab initio methods, do additional clustering, and select unique configurations. Now, we started from this structure that 8 years ago we came up with by using our chemical intuition and common sense, our knowledge. And my student has run this low mode AMD and found that the structure is very dynamic. Very importantly, depending on the level of method, you can read the details in this paper. You can make different structures. And what is very important, that our low mode molecular dynamics simulation was able to predict structures which were up to 80 kilojoules per mole at the PBE level, more stable than the initial structure. So the method has predicted structures which we didn't think about. When we did calculations, when we refined them at the PBE 0 level, the difference between the initial structure, that is the zero energy, it should be somewhere, I don't remember where it is, it should be somewhere here, between these structures and the most stable ones has reached like 150 kilojoules per mole. So our automated method predicted that we shouldn't have these trinuclear clusters, but they should isomerize in the peroxy species. Did we see them in experiment? One would say no, because we didn't consider them. We didn't simulate their spectrum. So we didn't even think that we can have these features. So we don't know if we saw them. But what's more important is that the experts, my colleague from PNNL was complaining that my model is wrong and proposed this one, which was 10 kilojoules per mole stable. Were all experts who were dealing with this system came up with the structures that were wrong. Yet they were all agreeing with the experiments. But machine came up with the different structures, which are more stable, but we never tested them. Now, I would probably skip that about the dynamics. So in reality, when we're simulating systems, we will have very often very dynamic systems where our stable configurations need to be pre-activated to get to the active state. And that is exactly the case with our peroxo species that needs to get open before it can activate methane. And it is a big question for myself that the state that defines reactivity is very different from what we measure in experiment. And that also explains partially the reason why we cannot predict how to be reactive. What we measure and what we observe is very seldom the thing that is actually defining the reactivity. With this, I would like to close this lecture with this summary that basically summarizes everything what I was telling and more about our vision. The problem of chemical system is that all chemical systems are enormously complex. When you try to increase model accuracy or the method accuracy, you always have to find a compromise between one and another. The way forward, as I see it, is complementing with database approaches and machine learning to speed up the calculations, and that could potentially improve the compromise between the method and the model accuracy. But it's important to realize that there should always be a theory and experiment crosstalk, not only from the perspective that your theory doesn't agree with experiment, therefore it's wrong, but it is very often the case that a theory based on your molecular model gives a wrong result. It can very well be that your chemical interpretation of your experimental result is wrong and need to be improved. So there should be a crosstalk. There should be constant exchange of the information. And right, that's it. That is my talk, and I'm grateful that for you to be here, and I would be happy to answer questions if you have.
Okay, thank you very much, Evgeny. Yeah, so we'll take questions. Actually, I have a question first. If anybody has a question, I think you can raise your hand and then
or type in the chat.
Or type in the chat. Yeah, so you can type in the chat. Let me ask you a question first. So could you tell us a little bit more about this new molecular dynamics? So you add the force and the RMSC between what and what?
I will tell you now. So it's very straightforward. The RMSD based, it's reaction exploration. I got confused. It's a different method that we are using. It's for reactivity analysis. So
Okay.
what here we are fixing the zeolite, and we do molecular dynamics only on the core, only on this extra framework species.
Okay.
And we add the bias from the low mode frequencies. So you have the low mode vibrations.
Okay.
That are usually small rotations, small changes.
Okay.
And you bias molecular dynamics simulation along these modes. So
Okay.
assuming that these are the directions of the shallow changes in the potential on the surface.
Yeah.
By this, we can overcome barriers of up to 100 kilojoules per mole.
Okay. Okay.
So that allows us to screen wider ranges of chemical space.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
We were using a similar approach with XTB for exploring configurations of manganese catalysts.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I see that Jean-Baptiste has a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Prof, for the nice presentation. Jean-Baptiste Fankam. I just hold a PhD in material science, and now I'm doing a postdoc in South Africa and in an experimental lab. So they mostly do catalytic there. So my interest here is to use computational chemistry to explain what they are doing experimentally. So your topic on computational catalysis was very interesting for me. So this permit me to open a bit my eyes about how to understand this process. Now, my question is that you mentioned about experiment and theory. So I would like to ask, which theory can I learn to more understand their catalysis process?
That's a difficult question you ask. Look, the problem is that when you carry out an experiment, so a catalytic experiment, when you say, I want to predict or explain a catalytic experiment, this one, you cannot come up with a method, because what exactly do you want to predict? Do you want to predict the active site that does this? Do you want to predict the behavior? So it all has to start with a molecular proposal. And then theory, in my opinion, has to serve a very simple purpose. You experimentalists come up with with a proposal, molecular proposal for a particular phenomenon, that some active site is reacting with something that can be computed, and you theoretically check it. I don't know exactly what chemistry you're working on in South Africa. If it's Fischer-Tropsch, I would say that this is a very big challenge. The type of reaction networks there are so complex that I would not ever do anything there. If you have spectroscopic data, calculating spectroscopic features is probably the way to go to start from. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, please, I didn't hear the last part of your speech.
Oh, I said
just before the end.
Yeah, I said that probably calculating spectra, spectroscopic features, so measuring spectroscopy and calculating spectra on different models is the way to go, because vibrational spectroscopy, we are very good with that. Our methods are very good. And if you ask about which method, computational method to use, I would be conservative. I would use periodic. If for surfaces, I would use periodic calculation with VASP, PBED3, and I would hope that it's okay.
Okay. Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Sunday. Can you see the question? Oh,
I don't see a question.
Okay, let me see. Read it. Is there any computational work that confirms the fact that something sites are precursors for polycations? Let me try to paste it.
Yeah, copy paste it.
Here's the question.
Is there any computational work that confirms the fact monocation negative sites are precursors for polycation? Oh, yes. Sunday, I was. I can. It's. I mean, what do you mean confirms? It's. Let me formulate it. I can't say that it confirms, but it is provides evidences. So I had a paper in it's an open access. Yeah, it's on the self-organization. On the self-organization of cations, where we were doing that. Self-organization cations zero line. I will find it and I will put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Which is yeah, everyone in the meeting. Sunday, you can see it in this paper. I hope that it answers. So basically, in this paper, I put together the idea that mononuclear sites have a great tendency to form multinuclear configurations, and the driving force is the compensating for the basicity of the oxygens and leucicity of the cations. My email address is everywhere available, so it's
okay. Evgeny, I have a question. Yeah,
yes.
I have a question. Why didn't you do more of kinetic Monte Carlo rather than dynamics?
Oh, we do a lot of we do that.
Okay.
We don't do kinetic Monte Carlo. We do microkinetic modeling.
Okay.
But it's the question that you want to answer. My experience is that we don't know the complete reaction mechanism very often, and therefore, if you it's very complex reaction system. If you know the answers, you do microkinetic modeling, you can feed the kinetics. So I didn't include it in this lecture, but we did it for an selectivity prediction, for CO2 hydrogenation on different sites, but that's it is a tool that allows you to have some prediction of the kinetics of the rates, but I don't find it that challenging.
Okay, another question is why don't people just do like molecular dynamics at different temperatures so that the system can sample different configurations?
Glad you asked.
Okay, and then just use that.
Yeah, this is exactly molecular dynamics simulation at 923 Kelvin is not allowing you to overcome a barrier that is more than KT.
Okay.
So this is the yellow line, are the species that we probability distribution of the structures that we obtained from simple molecular dynamic at 923.
Okay.
You increase exponentially, so 723 gives you already quite shifted to lower energies. And so this low mode molecular dynamics allows you to overcome higher barriers than KT, but yet follow the chemically relevant transformations. Because if you go to 1500, most of your molecular dynamics will be just atomization. You will break things apart. So when you do refining and DFT, you will get things here. When you follow low mode and low temperature, you keep it chemically relevant.
Okay, this smart. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So once again, so we thank
Christian.
Please, I have a question.
Oh, okay. Christian, right.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Evgeny, for this presentation. My interest is about knowing that we are doing simulation to be near the experimentals. And my question is, when you look, for example, structural property, the level of theory will not be the same as when you look at the spectroscopy property, for example. And it's different and when you are looking, for example, electronic or optical property. Which level of theory can you advise us on which software do you use for this work, for example?
That's a good question. As a rule of thumb, I personally believe that PBE0 functional single point correction on PBE energies would be sufficient to get quite a good energy values. For spectroscopy, hybrid DFT is good. So nowadays, look, if you are working with periodic DFT calculations, I still think that most of the time you will have to use PBE. You can try to use a scan functional to look at how they work, but I didn't see much improvement. For most of the systems that I'm working on, PBE is good enough. For spectroscopic features, if you want to predict spectra, it seems that going to hybrid DFT would be important. I personally like less parameterized functionals, therefore my choice is usually with this one, with the functions from Purdue. If you don't have a lot of resources to go to hybrid DFT or multi-reference, I think that machine learning potentials are being on the rise now. And this is something that I'm investigating to use. Look, many people are now using XTB. You need to just check that it gives you reasonable structures and go ahead for structural predictions. For spectroscopy, you most likely, for good electronic structure convergence, you will need to go to hybrid DFT.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Evgeny. If you have questions, Prof. Evgeny's email is in the chat, so you could always send him an email, and then we'll put the recording also online. If you want to share your slides with us, Evgeny, please, you could email it to me, and then I'll put it in our Google Drive. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much to everybody. Yeah.
It was a pleasure seeing you, many of you.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.